Hello everybody, it's me Julian, and welcome to the Philosophy and Theory live stream lecture. Today we're going to be starting a brand new lecture series in which I would like to host a deep dive, if you will, into Slavoj Žižek's conception of the political and how it relates to some of his philosophical arguments. What I'm going to be covering in this first lecture is Žižek's definition of the political, how he relates it to the notion of oppositional determination, which is a Hegelian concept. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about how Žižek uses that idea of the political to essentially articulate what you might call a critique of gender and race-based identity politics in relation to class categories, which in his book on hegemony and contingency, he articulates as class struggle versus postmodernism. But this is going to be the beginning of a new series, so there's plenty of time to break all of that down into subsequent chunks, but today I'm going to give you some of the basic parameters of the argument. My goal here is to make some of these ideas and concepts accessible without losing their complexity. To that end, I'd like to say thank you to everybody joining me today, and a special thank you to our patrons who allow me to keep hosting these weekly open access lectures. And I'm also delighted to announce that my latest ebook, titled The Fundamental Fantasy, is now available exclusively on Patreon. In fact, if you'd like to download that book, you can sign up today and thereby receive all the previous ebooks as well, including the complete guide to Žižek, Volume 1. If you didn't know already, it's essentially a recurring ebook subscription service where every 3 months I release a new ebook, and the latest one is available now. It is titled The Fundamental Fantasy. Okay, let's dive right in. Today we're going to be talking about Žižek's concept of the political. And it's important to note here that this is a concept that brings Žižek in, if you will, kind of conversation with notions of hegemony and antagonism that run throughout structuralist and post-structuralist discourse. So it's not unique to Žižek. But Žižek gives a definition of sorts when it comes to the conceptualization of the political. He says, it's pretty obvious to state that today the most political sphere is always the one which is categorized as being apolitical or non-political, which is to say the supposedly non-political space is itself the political one par excellence. However, Žižek adds to this a secondary category. He says, perhaps it is the very gap between the supposed political space and the non-political space which is indeed the political. Which is to say, Žižek argues that the political has nothing to do with the overt content of any political system or ideology, but instead the political can be found within the obfuscation or disavowal of a certain constitutive antagonism or gap that is implicit within the universal as such. And that's what I'm going to be trying to explain here today. And we'll have 3 months of subsequent lectures to sort of dive a little bit more deeply into this. So the title of this lecture series is going to be Vacillating the Semblances. And Vacillating the Semblances is not only the title of chapter 1 of Žižek's book, Less Than Nothing, but it's also an argument about the relationship of the universal to the particular, or what Hegel called oppositional determination. Now, I actually recently came across an example of oppositional determination. I was walking out of a concert hall and I was overhearing a conversation from 2 people ahead of me. And one of them said that they'd been to a restaurant in which the chefs prepared all of the food in a very theatrical way, like on a counter so that people could watch them preparing the meal. And the person said that he'd really enjoyed this restaurant. And he added to this a very interesting tidbit. He said, what I especially enjoyed about it is that they couldn't hide anything. Like there was nothing to hide, i.e. they were making the food in front of you, so they couldn't hide anything. You could see the meal being made. And of course, here we have, if you will, a certain symptom of contemporary capitalism, a kind of pseudo-theatrical production, a staging of productivity as such. For example, if you go into a supermarket today, especially in the United States, you'll see that there are various counters in which the food is quote unquote being produced. Like the baked goods are being warmed up, the sandwiches are being made, the pizza is being baked, etc. And yet this obscures the fact that what you don't see, what is entirely invisible, is the entire chain of production that has to occur in the first place for these ingredients even to show up in the supermarket so that they can be prepared for you. In other words, one of the central symptoms of contemporary consumer life and indeed of capitalism is that this theatricality, the spectacle of production, essentially has nothing to hide except for the fact that behind it takes place the real production. Which is to say, in a way, the real production is hidden precisely by means of this pseudo-production. Similar to the way in the kitchen that this person was talking about, the chefs came out to cook the meal in front of the public, and yet this obscures all of the preparation that had to occur behind the scenes. In other words, production, as Marx already observed within capitalism, is hidden in plain sight. The spectacle of productivity obscures the base layer, the zero-sum layer of exploitation and production that has to occur for this spectacle to even take place. This is what in Hegelian terms is known as oppositional determination, which is to say the thing isn't hiding something, it is itself hiding in plain sight, as it were. The spectacle of production obscures the production that is taking place behind it. Now, Žižek makes an argument about this in relationship to the political. He says, you could say that this is also true, this logic of oppositional determination, when it comes to the relationship between class, gender, and race. The traditional sort of pseudo-postmodern attitude is that conversations or discussions of race and gender are essentially additions to the concept or notion of class, that it is a democratization of resistance, that it is a broadening of the horizons. And yet what this does retroactively is that it particularizes class. Class becomes thereby simply one of the many avenues of resistance. In fact, if one views it through this lens, class no longer appears as the necessary one. After all, to consider the world in terms of simply the working class appears a reductionist take. And yet against this, Žižek argues that the oppositional determination is at work within race and gender. Race and gender aren't simply variations on class. Instead, they are that which hide class in plain sight, which is to say it is by means of discussions of identity politics and race and gender that the consideration of class appears to disappear. This supposed broadening, this democratization, this making visible of struggle by means of identity politics, therefore serves to achieve the exact opposite. The properly universal dimension of class, which we can get to in a moment, thereby is obscured. Class becomes simply another particular site of struggle, thereby losing the very core of it. In fact, the particularization of struggle into myriad forms of struggle thereby essentially allows the functioning of capitalism to take place as the insurpassable horizon of all meaning and ideology in the world. Therefore, one can score certain victories on behalf of representation and identity politics, and yet on a structural level, it does nothing to actually change the system that we're currently living in. However, I should say, and I should be very clear here, that Žižek's critique of identity politics should in no way be misconstrued as being a reactionary dismissal of it. Žižek is often taken here as a conservative or right-wing thinker when his argument is actually leftist in the extreme. He's arguing against the postmodern, if you will, post-structuralist movement beyond class, the idea that the struggle and the resistance of identity politics essentially absolves us from class-based notions as being unnecessarily rigid and dogmatic. And he argues instead that if we particularize the notion of struggle, losing the sense of the universal, we therefore lose the very point of struggle itself. Capitalism is all too happy to encourage and indulge the particular victories of identity politics. And Žižek says that on an even more dangerous level, the proliferation of identity politics leads us into a trap whereby narratives of victimhood become necessary in order to create a legitimacy for oneself which thereby leads to the ultimate narrative of victimhood, which is precisely the white ethnic one. However, let's take a step back for a moment. I want to return to the idea of the political, and then we can loop back around to Žižek's discussion of race and gender and identity politics. So I already introduced the notion that for Žižek, the political is about a certain constitutive gap that exists between the universal and the particular sphere, a gap that is constitutive to the social system and reality as such, but that's nevertheless quite abstract. So I thought I'd give you another example that I think can be quite instructive. Žižek argues in his book Contingency, Hegemony, Universality, which is a dialogue with Judith Butler and Ernesto Laclau. He argues that there's a certain displacement that takes place between a feudal society and a democratic one, which is to say, the thing that is considered an obstacle in a feudal society becomes the very solution within a democratic one. Now, what is the obstacle to a feudal society? Well, the obstacle to power in a feudal society is competition for power, which is to say, if the monarch is supposed to be the embodiment of a kind of central authority that thereby legitimizes itself and also creates the socio-symbolic grounding and horizon against which social participation takes place, then any resistance to the status quo would be destabilizing. In other words, the struggle for power is the obstacle to power in a feudal system. However, what democracy does and accomplishes, the so-called democratic solution, is that it elevates this struggle for power into the very reason or legitimization of power as such, which is to say, a healthy, thriving, functioning democracy is precisely one in which people do not agree, in which there is a constant deliberative struggle for power, in which different parties try to represent differing interests. And Žižek says that here we have the Hegelian transition from a gap which is in itself towards a gap which becomes for itself, which is to say, the gap that is occupied by power in a feudal society is in itself. It is embodied by the monarch, who is strictly speaking the symbolic figurehead of authority that thereby essentially creates the illusion of stability. Any resistance to this illusion is therefore considered something which would actually undermine the very foundations of society as such. Hence, the conservative reasoning of a feudal society is that one has to make certain sacrifices on behalf of the common good to preserve the peace. After all, if the monarch, as the guarantor of society, would fall away, this means that anarchy and chaos would ensue. The democratic solution to this is to take what appears to be the obstacle, namely this empty space of power which the monarch fills in, and to universalize it, to essentially turn this very struggle into the raison d'être of democratic participation as such. In other words, this gap, which in a feudal society is the gap between power and non-power, this gap is itself universalized into the very site or locus of power as such within a democracy. Hence why we end up with certain aphorisms about how a democracy is never complete, how it is never ending, how it is always at war with itself, etc. But Žižek adds to this what I think is a really interesting secondary thought. He says, perhaps it is too simple to simply treat democracy as this thing which exists in a kind of homogeneous state. What if democracy, in and of itself, undergoes the very same transition of in itself for itself, apropos the gap, which is the political, which is to say, what if the logic of oppositional determination is also at work at the heart of democracy? Well, how would that work? Well, Žižek lays it out like this. He says, we have essentially what you might call the first democracy, the democracy of the French Revolution, the rule of the people, which of course always lends itself to totalitarian excess. It's essentially the argument that the people equals the universal truth or core of a society. The rule of the people, therefore, is the universalization or the embodiment of the people's will. Now, on the one hand, this idea of the will of the people always begets the oppositional notion to it, namely the enemy of the people, hence the totalitarian core. But more than that, it also transposes and obscures the feudal logic into the rule of the people, which is to say now the people becomes the semblance of all authority that fills the gap of power as such. In other words, every such society, early democracies in the model of the French one, become about the rooting out of internal and external enemies so as to guarantee the will of the people, which by definition can't be symbolized and therefore has to rest upon a single person. Žižek says that the transition from this, if you will, first democracy to the second form of democracy is an oppositional determination. The second form of democracy is one in which government simply functions as the guarantor and protector of civic society, of civic participation. And now you can see how there's a full circle, which is to say, in the feudal system, the civic space was non-existent. It was essentially that people who existed lived out their corresponding roles and hierarchies so as to guarantee the continued existence of the monarch and his court, which essentially therefore was the heart of what you might call civic society and participation. Within a democratic society in its primordial form, by which I do not mean classic Greek antiquity, but I mean the French Revolution's conception of democracy, we have democracy as the embodiment of the will of the people. And yet this itself then segs into the oppositional determination of the feudal system, by which the government itself becomes depoliticized, neutered of its properly authoritarian content, so as to guarantee the interests of civic society as such. Now, of course, this is the emergence of a bourgeois society and a bourgeois ideology by which the powerful government, the elites, whatever you want to call them, exists so as to safeguard the continued existence and rights of the property holding class. Hence, essentially what takes place between feudalism and the emergence of, if you will, capitalism is a process of oppositional determination. This is why Marx argued that capitalism continues feudalism in its supposedly opposite guise, which is to say it is not simply that the feudal system of repression is continued into capitalism but disavowed. It is that by means of oppositional determination, the central mechanism is inverted and yet somehow continued, which is to say, in a capitalist society, government exists to protect the continued functioning of capital. This means that what takes place within a capitalist society is a post-ideological turn. A post-ideological turn, which you also might call post-political, is the process by which ideology and political allegiances come to seem suspicious to us. Instead, we have the emergence of a technocratic class, a centrist government that argues that the best way to govern is to essentially outsource problems to the consultant class so that we can have the frictionless, if you will, illusion of a politics that simply serves the continued reproduction of capital and thereby of capitalism. Now we're actually back at Žižek's original argument. Žižek's original argument is that the political, therefore, isn't simply the process by which the supposedly apolitical or post-political society is by itself political par excellence, but that the displacement or disavowal of this very gap is itself what constitutes the political. To give you this as a definition of a sorts, a formula of sorts, for Žižek, the political is never about the overt political content of something, nor about the political ideology behind it. Instead, for Žižek, the political is the investigative, or if you will, hermeneutic inquiry into the structural relationship between a society's universal and particular positions of belonging. The universal position within a feudal society is that the monarch essentially is the universal representative of all authority, of God. Therefore, the particular endowment of the peasant society is to sustain the universal core. Within a capitalist society, on the other hand, the governing class becomes particularized. It becomes devoid of any political or ideological content. It simply becomes post-political, technocratic, thereby serving the continued function of the supposed universal core, i.e. the naturalized mode of production, which is capitalism. Hence, what occurs from a Hegelian point of view is once again oppositional determination. Capitalism isn't simply another evolution of feudalism, even if one could argue that it is feudalism in disguise. Instead, it is the very, if you will, counterintuitive process by which progress ensues in its nominally externally other guise. Now we can take this idea and go all the way back to Žižek's critique of identity politics. On the one hand, postmodern identity politics present themselves as an expansion or broadening horizon when it comes to the multifaceted modes or spaces of resistance, which is to say, if global, contemporary, post-ideological capitalism isn't simply about the working class and the ruling class, then it seems to make sense that we would have a broadening of critical perspectives. This would include post-colonial ones, it would include critiques of race, critiques of gender, etc. However, the very particularization of these sites of resistance in a very public way serves to obscure the exact opposite, namely that no proper theoretical or practical consideration of an actual alternative to capitalism can take place. Now, it's important to note here for a moment that the reason that the working class was considered the universal class was never because the universal class was considered to be the majority, which is to say, for example, if you go back and you watch the movie Ants, the animated movie Ants, here we have the pseudo-Marxist take, which is that at a certain point, the ants who are oppressed by the grasshoppers realize that there are more ants than grasshoppers. So they are numerically superior. This means that they can take control. They can become the new ruling class and make the grasshoppers work for them. However, the Marxist perspective was never that revolution was supposed to be the process by which the people took power and inverted the power relations and made capitalism work for them, as it were, which is even today the central logic of most identity politics, how to make capitalism work for you, the disenfranchised class, etc. Instead, the argument was that the universal class was universal precisely because it was the disavowed part of no part. It was the necessary constitutive class that governed the very functioning of capitalism as such. Hence, the supplementary ideology or fantasy of capitalism was precisely that nobody was poor, but that everybody was on the up and up in the process of becoming rich, as it were. Therefore, the very foundational gesture of all resistance in capitalism is the realization that the working class is not a natural class, which is to say, it's not about representing the working class in a way that makes it more equally paid, etc. It is that the working class seeks to abolish itself, which is to say, the working class is the class which is excluded from the benefits of capitalism, yet told that it is itself on the rise, and that therefore, to alleviate the problem and the inequality of capitalism is precisely the process by which the working class essentially eliminates itself. Hence, the working class, from a Marxist position, is the universal class precisely because it is the only class that is not seeking representation. Instead, it is seeking absolution. It is seeking to essentially de-identify itself. And here we have the certain historical irony, which is that if the working class's goal is to eliminate the necessity for a working class, which would be the outcome of the elimination of capitalism, but vice versa, also if the working class eliminates itself, capitalism would be eliminated, then identity politics represents the exact inverse of this logic, namely the furthering of representation within the contemporary spheres of both cultural and financial production, which is to say, a widening of access to markets based on gender and race, the representation based on gender and race within corporate hierarchies, the expansion of publishing endeavors to bring voices of the marginalized into wider dissemination, etc. Now, once again, it's important to note that none of this is bad in and of itself, and certainly one should always place oneself on the side of this emancipatory progress. And yet, the theoretical argument against this postmodern attitude towards identity politics is that it simply thereby furthers capitalist reproduction. It is, if you will, a form of pseudo-resistance. Once again, it is therefore a form of oppositional determination. It appears to be the logical continuation of class by other means, class warfare by other means, as it were. And yet, it is in fact the exact opposite. It is the reduction of class into representational struggle within capitalism on behalf of capitalism. Now, of course, the post-political argument was always that one should strive for a better version of capitalism. Hence why corporations are always so happy to essentially adopt the slogans of identity politics and incorporate them into their own into their own sales strategies. Thereby, identity politics appears to be another monetizable fad, which can be essentially used to create further revenue on behalf of the entrenched creators of value. Against this, Slavoj Žižek argues that if we really want to articulate a new way forward for what you might call the left, we have to begin by articulating and returning to a critique of universalism versus particularity, which is to say, Žižek advocates a close reading of Hegel in order to reapproach the problems of Marxism that have become all too easily obscured within the contemporary left. Now, once again, I'd like to say that I'm trying to lay out the building blocks here. We will have 3 months of these lectures to sort of engage in a deeper reading and analysis of each of these arguments, but this is the overall approach. Now, I'd like to conclude briefly by explaining why I have chosen the title, The Vacillating of the Semblances. The idea of a semblance actually goes back to Plato. Plato argues, within his allegory of the cave, that the objects that exist in the world, the objects of phenomenal appearance, are semblances of an ideal or a pure form. The idea being that one would forego the semblances so as to return to knowledge or consciousness of such a pure form, what you might call truth or essence. This is the central gambit of Plato's metaphysical idealism, the idea that the semblance are something which obscure behind them, which hide something, an ideal substance. Žižek's Lacanian Hegelian wager, and this is hugely important and central to every argument that he makes, is that the semblances don't hide anything, which is to say that the semblances are themselves that which they hide. The example that he uses from a Lacanian perspective relates to the idea of a mask underneath which there is nothing. No hidden face beneath the mask, simply a void. This void is co-constitutive to the mask as such. Now, we will explain this, and I will try to explain this in more detail in the coming lectures. But Žižek's argument about the vacillating of the semblances, therefore, is the proposal of a kind of post-metaphysical alternative to the false universalism of postmodern identity politics. In fact, the postmodern false universal in general, which is to say, rather than the ad nauseum continuation of the particularization of identity, the discovery of many more different types of identities that can be added to the representational chart, instead, Žižek argues that we go back to what is hiding underneath, which is to say nothing is hiding underneath, and this means that the form of identity politics, which is the predominant form of resistance within contemporary capitalism ideology, is hiding itself in plain sight. And what is hiding in plain sight? It is precisely the, if you will, disavowed, obscured political content. The political as the gap, the transposition of the universal and the particular. Once again, this is very abstract. I'm using a lot of jargon here. This is something that we will explore in the coming weeks. Hence the title, The Vacillating of the Semblances. It is Žižek's approach. It is his proposition that there is a theoretical Hegelian Lacanian way of approaching the problem of the political that doesn't succumb to the what he calls the false universal of postmodern identity politics. Okay, so that's a basic introduction to what we're going to be discussing in the next couple of weeks. The lecture series is going to be called The Vacillating of the Semblances, which is going to be a deep dive into Žižek's political theory and his conception of the political. I should note, however, that there is a difference between Žižek's polemics and his political theory, which is to say, whilst the polemics are attached to his overall theoretical beliefs, they can sometimes be taken out of context. In fact, if you have seen clips of Žižek's various public appearances in which he appears to make political arguments that are always highly contrarian and controversial, you will realize that it can be helpful to understand some of the theoretical underpinnings to those arguments. In fact, if one approaches them head on, they can often appear to be saying the exact opposite of what he intends to say. This means that to understand Žižek's politics, it's not enough to simply engage with his polemics. In fact, to engage with them head-on can be very misleading. And so what I propose to do here in this coming lecture series, which is something that we haven't really done in any detail, is to engage with the theories and concepts underlying Žižek's polemics so as to lay out, if you will, a introduction of sorts to Žižek's politics and what he conceives of as the political. In this series, we're going to be talking about structuralism, post-structuralism, difference, antagonism, his relationship or increasing non-relationship to the theories of Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe, the concept of hegemony, which is actually very important for Žižek, and his relationship to Judith Butler. If you'd like to do some preliminary reading for this series, I would recommend that you pick up the Verso book titled Contingency, Hegemony, Universality, which is a wonderful introduction. It's quite technical, so beware, but it's a wonderful introduction to some of the differences and overlapping ideas between Ernesto Laclau, Slavoj Žižek, and Judith Butler. In fact, one of the things that I'm going to try to do in this series is to stage a kind of close reading of this book, Contingency, Hegemony, Universality. You might be able to find the pirated version online, or otherwise you can get it from the Verso publisher. Of course, I'd also like to plug my own continued ebook series, the latest edition of which is titled The Fundamental Fantasy. Okay, that's it for today. This is my introduction. We're going to be starting this lecture series properly next week, and it will last for 3 months. Thank you so much for watching today, and I'll see you next week.